I am here very much in the spirit of a two-way conversation. At the front end of the work of social ventures, I have a vivid recollection of starting on February the 4th in 2002. I remember that for two reasons. One is it was the day before my 42nd birthday. The second is as I was driving in across the Sydney Harbour Bridge to my first day at SVA, there was a phone call, and it was from the program manager for ABC Radio Breakfast Show, and there'd been a little gossip piece in the Financial Review, which is the Australian business paper, and it was something along the lines of David Clark, who was chairman of the bank, who was a mentor and a friend, must be choking on his cornflakes that somebody from the Millionaires Factory was jumping ship to go into the charity sector. And the program manager said, look, we saw this piece in Rear Window, which is the name of the gossip column. We'd like to talk to you this morning about what you're doing. And frankly, I thought, bloody hell, I have got nothing to say. You know, what I know about the non-profit sector would very comfortably fit on a postage stamp at this point. And one of the things for me from the earliest of days, and it's still now having had 15 years in the sector, is that the learning curve continues to be very, very steep. And one of the smartest things, and I'll reflect on some of this today, is that we look very closely at what were models of best practice around the world, in the UK, in the US. What were the things that we could learn from, the kind of scar tissue and experiences? So for me, even in the conversations over lunch, there's a lot happening, and I think there's a bit of a risk, and Australia's guilty of this, I think you may be too, that the grass is always greener on the other side. Now, your grass actually is particularly green, I know. And we do want to have a candid conversation around philanthropy and what works and what doesn't. So I'm here to share particularly some of the things that we've done, which we're proud of, but also the things that we've stuffed up. I always have a theory in life, having spent 15 years at Macquarie Bank, that you learn more from the scar tissue, you know, the things you bugger up that you don't do well, on the basis that if you can learn from that, hopefully you don't repeat it. So as I said to Alice, look, this is pretty informal. I don't want to take more than about 25 minutes or so and then really open it up to an interactive Q&A and conversation. And I wanted to do this in a couple of parts. One is to give a bit of personal background. There's a bit of bio background, but this is more, I think, a big driver in this, and it certainly was for me, was about who I am and where I grew up. And I think that context is important, because I think these things, everybody is involved in this space, and I have absolute confidence what draws everybody into this room is some personal passion or belief around social justice or issues of disadvantage and access, and we underestimate that at our peril. We really do. I'll talk a bit about the work of SVA, but not in there's some background stuff there on the structure of what we do for those interested. There's a lot of stuff on the website, but I really want to try and bring to life in practical ways, through a couple of case study examples, the kind of work that we've done. As I said to Alish, I think this stuff is much more interesting if you can talk at a practical level and try and bring to life what it is that we've done. And then before we open up, I'll offer some reflections around how we see the challenge of philanthropy in the Australian market, and leave it for you to sort of tease out what might be helpful or resonant in the work that we've done that might have some applicability here. So that's the kind of script. I know the picture's not super clear, but if you have a close look at that, this is a family photo that goes back to about 1968. I'm the grumpy looking git on your left in the bow tie. And it's an important photo for us as a family, because it's at Melbourne University, and it was the conferral of my father's third university degree. So I'm there, my brother's on your right, and Dad was actually the first in 4 generations to go past year 10 at school. He was an only child of a very working class background. His dad was a grave digger, a farmhand, worked in a factory of a small country town with a population of 4,000. And I always feel that for my brother, Barry, who, at the risk of sounding modest on behalf of another family member, is the serious talent in the family. He's a PhD in zoology, and he's one of the country's leading environmentalists. He runs the Pew Foundation. That for both he and I, the footsteps that we were able to walk in were very much the love and care of our parents, and the fact that education mattered. It really mattered. So Dad became a high school teacher and principal with a life of commitment to the public education system. Both Barry, my brother, and myself are proud products of the state education system. But the community that we grew up in, which is emblematic, I think, of an issue that faces most Western liberal democracies, is quite divided. The community that we grew up in would probably be regarded now as one of those so-called postcodes of disadvantage. It was a town called Morwell. For those who may have some familiarity with the map of Australia, 90 miles southeast of Melbourne, bit of an industrial belt. Literally, we were 100 yards from a brown coal open cut mine. In our first house, if the wind was blowing the wrong way, there'd be crap all over the washing and it'd have to be redone. Pretty working class community, but a real sense of community. But a lot of kids in that school, and Barry and I feel this pretty strongly, we know had capability and talent, but what didn't happen in the level that it should in that community, there wasn't the consistently high set of expectations in the school, in the community, sometimes from families who wanted to do the best, but they just didn't know. Well, our free kick was we kind of did because Dad had done that. And so for me, the pathway to Melbourne University, to Harvard Business School, and a career in investment banking was very much on the things that Mum and Dad brought us up with, is that if you have a crack and you have a crack at education, doors open up. And of course they do. We all know that. But the picture in Australia, and this is something that started to exercise my mind, I'd always had a strong interest for obvious reasons in terms of education and social justice given that background, was that one of the many things I learned at Harvard was focus on the data and the analytics. And the truth is, and some of you, this is a bit in the grass is greener category, Australia does have a good economic track record. We can speak proudly to 30 years of generally pretty consistent economic growth, pretty solid debt position. But if you lift up the carpet and look at the social indicators, what you'll know, and this is personal for me, is that if on average you're a kid in a school like the one that I went to, a bottom 20% postcode school, by the time you're 15, compared to a kid who goes to a top 20% school, you're 2.5 to 3 years behind on benchmark literacy, numeracy indicators. Now again, I'm sure I'm talking to the converted on this, but we all know what the attendant consequences of that are in terms of life outcomes and career outcomes. It's a social disaster, and what was particularly appalling is that over that period of a generation of economic growth, every bit of data that you looked at on inequality, in many cases, hadn't got worse, and in quite a few cases, significantly worse. So if you care about the proud Australian egalitarian tradition, which I think is a good thing we inherited from a lot of your forebears and Scottish forebears, we were, in any level we were starting to lose that. And I guess if my wife was here, she'd probably call it a bit of a midlife crisis. I'd started to think about, courtesy of the economics at Macquarie Bank, which I enjoyed enormously. I was a co-founder of Macquarie's original private equity business. We'd invested close to $500 million in 42 companies over a 13-year period, and we generated a very healthy set of economics for the bank and for us as a family. So personally, professionally and financially, that had been incredibly rewarding. But the truth was, for me, at the age of 41, much as there were mentors who became close friends out of the bank, I was kind of looking in the mirror and thinking, I don't know that I've never been that motivated by money. My wife Jenny has the same set of values around community engagement. What mattered for our kids was that we wanted them to connect to a broader community, and we were living in the pocketed 1% type community, is the truth. And we both felt pretty uncomfortable with that. And so the idea, this sort of half-formed idea for me was, I need to do something different. And I didn't know then what it would be, but I knew that I had to try and find some way of harnessing whatever it was that I'd learnt in the previous 20 years at business school and at Macquarie, and try and apply that in some sort of constructive way to the sort of issues that I'd lived and seen. The kids that I knew at school, when I went back to Morwell, my hometown, I'll never forget going back to a funeral of a family friend and seeing the guy who was the standout maths kid in year 10, and he was a grave digger. Now, there's nothing wrong with a grave digger. My granddad was a grave digger. But that kid wasn't given the opportunity to be the engineer that I suspect he could have been. It wasn't expected. The school didn't expect it. His family didn't expect it. And guess what happened? He didn't expect it. So what happened? And I think that's bloody disgraceful. So when my head was in that space of what do you do, where do you go, as with a lot of things in life, there's a bit of luck and serendipity. I'd started to explore looking at various things that connected hopefully business networks to education programs. And a friend sent me an email that said, you should have a look at this, and it was from the search firm Egon Zehnder, and I knew the guy who was involved, and it said, we're looking for somebody with a venture capital background and a social conscience to set up this new initiative called the Social Ventures Initiative. And the short of a slightly longer story was that the idea behind that was, could you apply in hopefully sensible and sensitive ways business and private equity disciplines to backing not business entrepreneurs but social entrepreneurs, people who could run programs that did something different that would make a difference to the school that I grew up in. And so I started as founding chief executive on February the 4th. What I said in that radio interview, by the way, and I thank God I had half an hour to think about it, and it was phone a friend time. I called a mate of mine who used to give us PR advice. I said, they want to talk to me, I've got bugger all to say. And he said, calm down, why are you doing this? And I said, well, I know there are a bunch of people like me, and it's a conversation after every second glass of red wine that how do we engage in the community and how can we do something more substantial than just turning over the snags at the kids' barbecue or volunteering at the footy? And he said, that's a really good message. And I said, but I got nothing else. He said, just keep repeating it. So I did. And the interesting thing was, within the space of 2 weeks, what became the heart and soul of SVA was an incredibly affirming feedback and calls from people who said, look, I don't know who you are or what you're doing, but it sounds sensible. Can I help? And the can I help call came from people like Sari Rankin, who was in her mid-30s, stellar career at Accenture, who finished up working 2 or 3 days a week, became a key part of all of the work that we did. You know, I'm using her as an example of the kind of zeitgeist that we were tapping into. An overachieving professional with a profound sense of social justice who wanted to use what was then a decade-long, very successful career to do something that could have impact. And as SVA has grown, and I won't go through the numbers, but one of the many things I learned from my mentor and friend David Clark, who was chairman at Macquarie Bank, was this game is really simple. Find really smart, motivated people, give them rope and opportunity to connect it to some pretty clear, broad but ambitious goals. And that's what Social Ventures did. At its heart, that's why now there is a team of over 60 people. I stepped down as CEO 18 months ago, and I can say without any false modesty, the place is in way better shape than it was when I left, which suggests I should have buggered off earlier. But there's a terrific guy with a private equity background. There's a team of 60 people. I just saw the latest 5-year plan, and this is not just about growth for growth's sake, clearly, but it's emblematic of the catch and the traction of getting good people connected to cause. SVA plans to be 120 to 150 person organisation with a broad-based revenue and funding model of 25 million. It's currently about 12 or 13. And it will do that. It will do that because there's an architecture around the work we do in backing great organisations and securing funding for that. There's an architecture around providing really high-quality consulting and getting paid for that, not at the egregious rates I was used to having to pay at Macquarie Bank, but McKinsey, Bain, Accenture, BCG, quality service for the sector at affordable prices, making a huge difference. And the third part of that portfolio is impact investing. How do you think about applying financial disciplines in different ways for social purpose outcomes? So that's the kind of core structural architecture of SVA. And rather than talk about the structure, as I said, I want to just share a couple of quick case study examples that brings to life what that work is about. I mean, in consulting, for example, that team has now done, I think, pretty much more work around social return on investment than pretty much any other organisation in the world. And this social return on investment, as it implies, is a very powerful model that aims to articulate as clearly as possible and quantify what are the cost of programs, what impact are they having, can we be very clear about the assumptions behind that. It's not a silver bullet solution, we don't suggest it is, but it draws on this idea of sensible, sensitive impact measurement and metrics. And the broad work of consulting in providing that strategy lens, consulting team has now done over 600 projects with over 300 clients, and SVA Consulting has become a go-to resource for the sector and for funders. You know, so it took a long time to build that, but I think the market is becoming more sophisticated and recognising That's a good thing to do, that's a good thing to have, and with due respect to the generosity of major consulting firms who do that pro bono, sometimes you get what you pay for. You know, we've got a team of 25 people who live and breathe this business. They get paid not what they'd get paid in that other world, they get paid okay, and we charge reasonable, accessible rates, and I think that's the key to a lot of the work we've done. I want to give a quick example in an area pretty dear to my heart around a program we've supported that brings to life this idea of venture philanthropy. As you would gather from the school that I went to, there are a lot of schools in the bottom 20% at home that just aren't connected to the opportunities to provide pathways to employment for kids. And the Beacon Foundation we met in my first 6 months at Social Ventures, they'd started in a really tough school in Launceston, which is the most disadvantaged state of Australia. And this was the most disadvantaged suburb in the most disadvantaged state, Brooks High School. 30% of the kids in 1992 leaving the school at the end of year 10 going on to the dole, the unemployment benefit. And the program started with a brilliant social entrepreneur called Bill Lawson, who'd done some work in a more affluent school in that area, which was his alumni school. Got a bit of press in the Launceston Examiner, and the headmaster of Brooks High School, the tough school, saw this, called this guy Bill Lawson and said, "Mate, great you're doing good work in the community, but you're working in a pretty toffish school. If you really care, come and talk to me, because I'm a failure. I'm a failure as a principal because 30% of these kids are walking out the door at the end of year 10 to go onto the dole, and I don't know what to do." So Bill met that principal, whose name was Peter Hutchinson, and what happened was this kind of interesting experiment where Bill said to Peter, "I don't know you or this school, but I know this community and I know employers. I know that there are people who are motivated to support you, but you've got to get off your arse. You've got to come out of the office and meet with me with employers, and we'll find ways to mentor and support and buddy up with the kids and get them to see that there is the possibility of a job, of a traineeship." The end of that first year, and you see here kids at the start of the year, which is a bit of PR, but there was substance behind it. They sign in a very public setting a thing called the No Dole Declaration. And it's a commitment for the kids at the front end of year 10 saying, we will not accept as an outcome of our year of school going on to the dole. So unless it was followed up with programs, a bit hokey. But at the end of the first year of this bold experiment, unemployment levels for kids exiting the school weren't 30%, they were 12%. They said, we better do this again. The next year, it was 2%. And I visited that school, and we as you do in Ireland, we were talking sport and rugby. It was like visiting the franchise of a successful sporting team. You walk, I was waiting in the principal's office, and there's banners up all around the wall. 94, 2%, 95, 1%, 96, 0, 97, 1%. You don't want to be the kid that buggers up that record. And instead of that being the school where if a kid applied for a job, it was the one thrown in the trash bin, it became a school of choice for employers. Now, when we met Bill Lawson and Peter Hutchinson, principals being principals, my dad was a principal, so I know how other principals were saying, how do we access this, how do we share that? And when we met Bill, we were working it out as we went, but our theory was that if we can find programs like that work, could we help them grow? Could we help them reach other schools? And the way we did that in that partnership was we found a really terrific Bain consulting resource who developed the organisation's first business plan. We helped Scott Harris, who was the bright young chief executive, to access and think about other broader funding networks. And probably most critically, we gave them what wasn't big dollars, it was $55,000, but it was their first bit of capacity funding. Capacity as in administration funding. Because one of the big problems in Australia, and I know it exists here too, is funders who say, love what you're doing, I'll fund the kids, I'll do a scholarship, I'll fund the program. You want me to fund people? Like you want me to fund marketing, strategy? That's a waste of money. Well, I spent 15 years in a business where that's all we funded. And if I went to David Clark, who was our chair, and said, we're funding the growth of the organisation not by funding to hire great people, we would never invest it in anything. So I never understood this disconnect between a business world which values high calibre people and a non-profit world where funders say, I don't want to fund the kids. Didn't make sense. So that $55,000 was an enabler for Scott to find the first additional admin resource. And that enabled the program to start taking baby steps in supporting another 20 schools. From that seedling, this is what happened. Now this slide's now a little bit out of date, but that first $55,000 is now a pimple. And it is a pimple because what Beacon has been able to demonstrate through tools like social return on investment, the cost savings of getting unemployment levels for kids coming out of school from 30% to 2% is very significant. That's actually an easy sell to investors, to funders. And in terms of that organisational growth, this is now a robust organisation. It's national. It has an annual budget of around $4 million Aussie. Divide that by about 1.5 for euros. And 2 weeks before I came away, they've just secured a really, really significant strategic bit of partnership funder from Australia's largest foundation, the Ramsay Foundation, which matches $10 million of Ramsay Foundation funding with $10 million of Tasmanian state government funding, the most disadvantaged state in the country. And they're going very explicitly into a community development model anchored in schools in the toughest schools in Tasmania. So that idea of access to networks, thinking about strategy, broadening and sustaining funding networks is heart and soul of what we're about. And we've made plenty of mistakes. That's obviously a success story, and I'm conscious of the time. We can come back to some of the warts and all stories, but the biggest mistakes we made were where organisations, and I've been in the sector long enough as a non-profit person to say this, there are a lot of non-profits, and I saw a bit of this in the business world, who say, yeah, that's great, we want to do strategy, we want to do the growth thing, but actually they just want to check and they want you to bugger off and get out of the road. And they're not that interested in accountability and impact. We can't get to that sort of sustainable funding model unless you're prepared to do what Beacon were prepared to do. And it wasn't all hearts and flowers. They had some schools where their results were terrible. And for those who funded those schools, that was pretty challenging. But they had the integrity to say, this funding hasn't achieved the results we'd like, but we think we can restructure the program because we've learnt from that. And I think that's critical, and it's a missing link. If I can, and again, I want to make sure I stick to time to open it up. There's a story, I think, in the deck, so I don't need to spend too long on this, but one of the things that really was a bit of a attention grabber at home was a deal that we're involved in putting together that raised $165 million to acquire what was a pretty sad story of corporate entrepreneurial spivviness and failure. So the ABC childcare centres were set up in the late 90s. Is that, if you can see the graphic, that's the share price, by the way. So if you're an investor in ABC childcare at its market peak, share price was $8.50. It was worth $2.6 billion, and it had accessed $1 billion of debt from the 4 major Australian banks. It very publicly went into bankruptcy in late 2008. And the kind of big picture idea that came out of a lot of our social enterprise work, where we had started to experiment with the idea, and I know had a good conversation over lunch with the folk behind the social finance model, that idea of soft debt lending to facilitate social purpose organisations. This was really a larger scale example of some work we've been doing, quite parallel to the work that you're doing. But the thinking was, hey, if we can access larger scale funding from high net worth funders and investors, maybe in a competitive tender situation, we could actually think big, and we could buy a footprint of 700 childcare centres. This is a big business, by the way. The business that was sold had 700 centres, 72,000 kids. It was the biggest in terms of market share, 11% market share, 13,000 staff. This is not a small shop. But the ambitious goal was, if you could run this with business disciplines, raise the money to do it, and trap the surplus after you'd repaid debt for social purpose, you could actually do something potentially transformational. And that was very much, Ailey spoke before about the significance of collaboration and partnership. There were many components of this transaction, and that Cassandra Wilkinson article does a pretty good job of teasing those out. For a start, there were 4 leading non-profits who kind of lined up to do this. That's pretty unusual. The sector often doesn't cooperate like that. So that was challenge A, getting those 4 quite different organisations to work together. Challenge B was how to find the dough, and this is how we solved for it. And again, this is explicitly a partnership funding model. We raised what we call social capital. So for those with a finance background, that's subordinated debt. This is debt which paid an interest rate of 12%. So we pitched investors saying, we think this can work. We want to raise money from you on the basis that you'll get it back, and you'll get it back with a 12% interest rate. Now that wasn't the 30% plus rate of return that we were able to generate in our private equity days at Macquarie Bank, but hey, in the current environment, who wouldn't take 12%? And we raised it because we accessed particularly another great mentor and friend of mine from Macquarie Bank, Robin Crawford, who was the founding director and the founding chairman of this beast, which became called Good Start. Robin, very high energy guy, made a lot of money out of Macquarie Bank, incredible supporter of social ventures. We knew we had to raise at least $22.5 million. Robin personally underwrote $5 million of that. And we finished up raising from 41 investors, including our family. My wife is a tax lawyer, so she's fairly conservative. And she was a bit sceptical about this, but she finished up being quite happy about the 12% return. We were able to raise that funding. The non-profits put capital in. We raised $15 million from the federal government, who put that in the form also of a soft loan. And with that $45 million capital base, we could go to National Australia Bank, which is one of the big 4 who'd lost money in this, and raise the other $120 million that we needed. So but structurally very similar to the stuff that we'd done on a smaller scale. Identical, actually. But if you pull any of those pieces out, the social capital from investors, the government funding, or the National Australia Bank funding, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so what we were able to do with that was we were announced as the successful bidder in December of 2009. We paid $95 million for a business that had been worth $2.6 billion. And the quick follow-up, we had a set of follow-up 5-year celebrations. All of that debt was repaid 2 years ahead of schedule 18 months ago. To the extent we had unhappy investors, it was because they said, I haven't got 12% elsewhere in my portfolio, do you have to redeem it? Well, that was part of the deal. It was expensive debt for us now. We're generating a surplus of around $40 to $50 million a year, consistent with the charter and the structure of this, that is ploughed back for investment in better quality early learning. We've got 137 of our centres that are in low CEFA, which is the low socio-economic centres, the bottom 30%. So they're the centres, and again, many of you will be familiar with this. They need additional resources, they need community engagement support, they need speech pathology, they need support around English as a second language. So you can throw resources at that where you know the impact's going to be greater. And what we're starting to do increasingly is use that as a platform, because we're a big player. We can throw our weight around, and we are very engaged with government at an advocacy and lobbying level. And again, that's part of the learning for me continuing, is that you can do great work with a beacon, you can do great work with Good Start, but the structural issue in Australia in early learning is that we're bloody awful at investing significantly in early learning. And if you're into this stuff, and from people who know better than me, the huge motive for me was the game of life and the economics of life are heavily determined by the time a kid is 3 years old. Now, at one level that's profoundly depressing, but there's all sorts of neuroscience and evidence that whatever investment you make after that, you're playing catch up, and it's actually a lot more expensive. So that area, how can governments not get the criticality of that? And we're off the pace on that, but we're learning to throw our weight around. And it comes back to a core point, and it's this, that whatever we've done, the aggregate, and I'll come to some sort of quick general commentary about the funding model for this. In Australia, the level of tax-deductible giving annually is about $2 billion. And there's been some progress, there's been some good points of light, But the level of government funding, depending on how you slice and dice federal and state governments, is probably around $220 billion a year. So one of our big learnings, and certainly for me, was unless you play in the game of government engagement at an advocacy and policy and funding level, you're actually a smaller piece of a much bigger puzzle. You know, that's why Beacon pushing into that partner funding space, that's why Good Start advocating and engaging with government is just so critical. Just a couple of quick things before I close and open it up. I said this is very much a two-way conversation, and in the spirit of candour, in the engine room of SVA, one of the many things I didn't know and was acutely conscious of, I loved what I was doing from the day I walked into that office to start SVA. And at the end of my first year, we had what I realised was a big free kick, because the non-profits and AMP Foundation, who had been a corporate partner, had committed funding for the first year. But by August of the calendar year, I'm thinking, this is great, I think we're making a bit of progress. Bloody hell, where's the money for next year? And so it was phone a friend time, and so I did a lot of homework in Australia. I talked to the big non-profits who had good reputations, and the honest truth was none of them I thought were particularly good or insightful on funding, particularly with a market that I thought could be more accessible, which was the high net worth kind of social investor market. So the friend turned out to be somebody in this room, Kingsley Akins, who's rightly described by Ailish as an icon in philanthropy and fundraising, and that's not just in Ireland, that's globally. And Kingsley typically was incredibly generous in sharing a model of donor and relationship building. And I'll remember you, mate, vividly in the first year saying, Traill, it's a process. And he was absolutely right. And that process, which now sees a pretty rusted on philanthropic support base of $4 or $5 million a year, started with some of the names of people I've been mentioning. They didn't write cheques of $500,000 or $1 million then, it was $5,000. But we followed up. We took them to Brooks High School. We engaged them in what we were doing. And somebody like Robin Crawford has probably directly and indirectly given SVA $7 or $8 million. And he's underwritten all of the significant and hard things we've done. When we wanted to set up SVA Consulting and said, look, we think there's a business opportunity, we're not sure how it'll work, what do you need? If you think you can set up something that works, I'll provide the $500,000, see if you can get that dollar match from somewhere else though. And he did. When we thought about setting up an impact investing business, same conversation. We think this can work. We've got a terrific guy who was an old colleague out of Macquarie to run that business. That's now a team of 10 people. But the working capital to get great people to start that came from Robin Crawford and another private equity contact. So, you know, that capital, that money exists. You can't get there on day one, but Kingsley was right. And that process of relationship building and engagement, I think, is what the opportunity is. So before throwing it open to the floor, a couple of headline things. Look, there's still a bit of a dark secret in Australia. I think we have made some progress. You know, one of the things I learnt from Kingsley was this idea that we need to move from this idea of what I think you call checkbook charity. You know, I call it spray and pray giving. It's bites of $5,000 and $10,000. It's not strategic, it's not funding capacity, to strategic and engaged philanthropy, accountable, funding the hard bits, measurable. And the journey for us and a lot of our funders has been actually, and I don't mean this in a patronising way because we're learning this as we go, is moving them from that corner to this corner. And that's the difference between the, mate, you turn up to my charity dinner and we'll have too many reds and we'll buy some bit of crap, you know, the signed Irish team jersey from last year, stick it in the downstairs toilet and that'll be 1,500 euros that we'll forget about. That won't, you're not going to migrate that 1,500 to $500,000. But Robin Crawford wrote those big cheques, as did others, because they got that what we were doing was strategic and it was changing things in substance. And so we've still got a long way to go at home. The data will tell us that high net worth giving levels in Australia compared to the US are about an eighth or a tenth. And the ultra high net worth we categorise as those with investable assets of more than $20 million outside their homes. What snuck up on Australia, I don't know the Irish data well enough, but I suspect you've got a parallel story post the recovery, is that in Australia there are now 3,000 or 4,000 individuals or families in that category. That's a lot of capital from people who, in my experience, approach the right way, want to do it. And my closing comment is, which is why I like the Beacon case study. A lot of people say, well, that's all right for you, Michael. You spent 15 years at Macquarie Bank. You knew Robin Crawford. You knew David Clark. I did. Did that help? Yes, it did. But of anything we've done at SVA, what I'm most proud of is that the proof point is not what SVA's done. It's the organisations we've been privileged to partner with. Beacon didn't have any of those contacts. Why are they now in the robust shape they're in? Because they had a chief executive who was absolutely committed to building a sustainable model of high net worth donor relationships and corporate partnerships and bringing the corporates and the individuals on that journey. So it's absolutely doable, and it goes back to Kingsley, August 2002. It's a process. And the truth is, many talk about saying, I get that, but not many actually commit to doing it. I'll close there because I don't want to go on for too long and want to open up to Q&A, but thank you.